The Renaissance plague that ate faces. In 1494, French King Charles VIII led his army into Naples to claim the Italian throne. His soldiers came from across Europe: French knights, Swiss mercenaries, Spanish fighters, and Italian allies. After their successful conquest, these men celebrated in the taverns and brothels of Naples with wine flowing freely and local women eager to entertain the victorious army. This mass interaction of soldiers and locals helped spread what contemporaries called the French disease, now widely identified as syphilis. This celebration created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Thousands of soldiers from different regions gathered in one city, sharing close quarters and intimate contact with the local population. The mixing of populations that had been geographically isolated for generations allowed pathogens to jump between groups that had no immunity to foreign diseases. What emerged from this mixing would become one of history's most horrifying plagues. Within weeks of the celebration, soldiers began developing unusual symptoms. The disease started with painful ulcers on the genitals, but this was only the beginning. Unlike other known ailments, this new plague refused to remain localized. After the initial sores appeared, victims developed high fevers that left them bedridden for days. Their bodies erupted in rashes that spread across their skin like wildfire. Muscle pain racked their bodies, making movement excruciating. But the early symptoms were nothing compared to what followed. As the disease progressed into its secondary and tertiary stages, the real horror began. The so-called French disease produced gummatous lesions and destructive ulcers that penetrated deep into tissue. These weren't surface infections that could heal with time. The lesions burrowed deeper into flesh, creating craters that exposed the skeletal structure underneath. Secondary manifestations caused painful sores to erupt across victims' entire bodies, while tertiary symptoms led to severe tissue destruction. The disease attacked its victims systematically. Flesh began rotting while people were still alive. Chunks of decaying tissue would fall off bodies as people walked through the streets. The stench of rotting flesh surrounded the afflicted, announcing their presence before they could be seen. Arms and legs developed open wounds that never healed, constantly weeping pus and blood that stained clothing and left trails on the ground. The facial disfigurement was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this plague. Tertiary syphilis targeted the soft tissues of the face with particular cruelty, producing gummatous lesions that destroyed normal features. Noses simply rotted away, leaving gaping holes where normal features had been. Lips dissolved, exposing teeth and gums in permanent ghoulish grins. Eyes became infected and swollen until they burst, leaving empty sockets that oozed continuously. Ears crumbled and fell off, leaving ragged stumps on the sides of heads. Despite this massive tissue destruction, the disease rarely killed quickly. Victims survived for months or years with their faces eaten away and their bodies covered in festering sores. They walked through European cities as living corpses, their humanity stripped away by a disease that seemed designed to inflict maximum suffering while keeping its victims alive to endure every moment of their deterioration. This Renaissance strain of syphilis was far more aggressive than the modern version of the disease. Today's syphilis progresses slowly and can be easily treated with antibiotics. The Renaissance variant moved quickly through its stages and caused much more severe tissue damage. Modern syphilis rarely causes the extreme facial disfigurement that characterized the 15th century outbreak. Something about this particular strain made it exceptionally virulent and destructive. As Charles VIII's army disbanded and soldiers returned to their home countries, they carried the disease across the known world. French soldiers brought it back to France, where it spread through the population within months. Spanish mercenaries transported it to Spain, and from there to the New World colonies. Swiss fighters carried it back to German territories. Italian soldiers spread it throughout the Italian peninsula. By 1520, the disease had reached Africa and Asia, demonstrating how rapidly contagion could move with early modern travel and warfare. European cities became filled with walking nightmares. Imagine trying to conduct normal daily business while surrounded by people whose faces had been eaten away by disease. Market squares hosted vendors whose noses had rotted off. Churches welcomed worshippers whose lips had dissolved. Taverns served customers who lacked eyes. The visual impact of this epidemic was as psychologically damaging as it was physically destructive. The social fabric of European society began tearing under the strain of widespread disfigurement. Families abandoned members who showed symptoms of the disease. Marriage contracts included clauses about what would happen if either party developed the plague. Entire neighborhoods were avoided if too many residents showed signs of infection. The normal social interactions that held communities together became dangerous because close contact could spread the disease. Religious leaders proclaimed that this plague was divine punishment for moral corruption, particularly sexual immorality. The fact that the disease often began with genital symptoms seemed to confirm that God was punishing humanity for lustful behavior. This interpretation added shame to the physical suffering, making victims social outcasts even among their own families. Artists and writers began incorporating images of facial disfigurement into their work. Paintings from this period show an obsession with decay and bodily corruption that reflected the reality of daily life in plague-affected areas. Literature became darker and more focused on physical suffering and moral punishment. The cultural production of an entire generation was shaped by witnessing the slow decay of human bodies. The epidemic changed social attitudes toward sexuality and fears of contagion, reinforced religious explanations for moral punishment, and influenced art and literature of the era. This plague created lasting cultural trauma that influenced European society long after the disease itself had evolved into a less virulent form.